So to return very briefly before I close to this question of gender-inclusive language. As I said, these new inclusive language lectionaries try to filter out this difficult word father. Whether they can actually do so or not is a serious problem. Islam, as I said, avoids this problem by not calling God father at all. Can this actually be done in Christianity without entailing actual doctrinal mutilation? Is it possible to censor out this term father, which Jesus himself appears to have used? Well, in Britain recently we had a British Council of Churches doctrinal commission on Trinitarian doctrine today, and this paper acknowledged the force of the feminist polemic, and I'll just quote to you its response. The word father is to be construed apophatically, that is, by means of a determined thinking away of the inappropriate, and in this context that means masculine, connotations of the term. What will remain will be an orientation to personhood, to being in relation involving origination in a personal sense, not maleness. That's what they say, and I have to say that I find this unsatisfactory, and so do many of the feminist theologians. You cannot have a concept of fatherhood that is stripped of all of its male connotations, because then you're not left with fatherhood. It's not even parenthood, since parenthood itself can only have two modalities. I think that the commissioners here are simply engaging in an exegetical sleight of hand. And this again may be something that's required by the whole structure of this belief system, which, as the great British Unitarian John Biddle put it, this theory is fitter for conjurers than for Christians. I think that this kind of talk, his days are numbered if Christianity is to remain morally and intellectually coherent. How it actually falls out is obviously not ultimately for me as an outsider to say, but will be resolved through internal Christian reflection. Essentially, that's all I wanted to say about this obviously complex discussion that has unfolded between these two great religions, continues to unfold, and will continue to unfold. Perhaps it's appropriate to conclude by summarizing my own personal view on this. I myself think that it is time for the religions to grow up and to transcend the old, disreputable record that they have all acquired of sniping, of polemic, of mutual demonization. The great Catholic theologian Hans Kuhn has pointed out that there can be no world peace without peace between the religions. And I think there will only be peace between the religions when we recognize that we are no longer each other's enemies. Christianity is not a major threat to Islam. Islam is not a major threat to Christianity, and so forth. The real threat that equally threatens all of the world's religions is the common spirit of negation, selfishness, materialism. That is what is really endangering religious faith in today's world. And once this realization has been made, and we have the maturity to acknowledge that we are no longer each other's enemies, when we recognize that we have our backs up against the same wall, then we will be able to use what we have in common, which is quite considerable, as a basis for creating a common front against this spirit of greed and negation which is causing so much suffering in today's world. And it's my hope and my prayer that all of us here will have the generosity of spirit and the vision to make this very important project a reality. It's my fault. Yes?
Is in the Quran, like when you say Allah, you use the pronoun he, but I mean that's just a way of saying it.
That's right.
How's he, how's Allah termed? I mean, in this translation you have we and our. How?
Yeah. The male personal pronoun is used for God, for Allah, but the theologians and the commentators all unanimously say that's not because God is male, but because Arabic has no neuter. And it's conventional in Arabic to use the male gender for what is neuter, unless it's something neuter and plural, in which case you use the female. But I can point to you hundreds of texts, and no doubt Quranic experts like Dr. Mir can do the same, in which the theologians go out of the way to say, no, God is not male, Allah is not male.
What is this hour and we?
Well, this is part of the specific nature of the Quranic discourse, that God often changes his manner of speech. Sometimes he calls himself I, sometimes we or are, sometimes he. The Quran comes at its issues from different perspectives. It's sometimes one of the confusing things for people who come to the Quran for the first time. They expect to see God always as he with a capital H. Sometimes God speaks in the first person, depending on the kind of point that's being addressed. Yes?
You had mentioned somewhere toward the end that one of the Arabic terms for God was also a word for room.
Womb. Sorry, yeah. I'm not standing in exactly the right acoustic position.
It kind of filled the same purpose, whether it be womb or room. Because when you said that, I kind of flashed on the Dar al Islam, chapter 11, where he talks about the usefulness of a cup is in the empty space, and the spokes of the wheel are really not as useful as the space that supports them, and how perhaps it's the energy between things that is the God self, or the God energy, or the creative force, and maybe that is the less gender-bound envisioning of a God force, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that would be a legitimate way of seeing it as well. But Islam generally has tried, although it maintains the idea of the transcendence of God, nonetheless it tries to retain a personal God. It's not Buddhism or Taoism. You pray to God as if you were praying to a person, even though that person is unimaginably different. So Islam hasn't gone as far perhaps as the Far Eastern religions have gone in turning God into an impersonal force. But yes, womb is the term that the Prophet himself used. This is not just a theological or mystical speculation. The Prophet himself, in a sound hadith, said that God's name, Ar-Rahman, the all-compassionate, or the all-loving, is derived etymologically from the concept of womb.
The form of worship doesn't necessarily exclude a mutual perception of that force.
That's true. Islamic worship has two registers. It has the formal salat, the 5 daily prayers, which is like an affirmation of something that's very awesome and very distant. This tanzih, the divine transcendence, otherness. But it also has the personal aspect of prayer, the dua, when Muslims raise their hands like that, Christians do it like that, Muslims do it like that, which is when you're addressing a personal God, which is petitional prayer, which is the address to the immanent God. Islam tries to recognize both of those registers. So the Quran says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," nothing is like God. And yet it also affirms the divine immanence by saying, and God is closer to man than his jugular vein. It does these two things, and it's really for the mystics to show how those two things are compatible.
The jugular vein and the Chinese dantian, just below the belly button, would not be an uncommon comparison, perhaps. There's just a different physical location for God being that close.
Yeah.
Something else that you had said toward the end, that Islam sees God as transcendent, non-gendered. There's nothing in Christian doctrine that sees God as gendered, but rather that Jesus' formulation of a relationship with God was unto Abba or Daddy. Now that does no doubt cause problems for feminists. I know, heaven knows, okay? But by the same token, Christian doctrine does not explicitly say God is a male. However, the language and the force of the limitations of language are things that get us into trouble.
Sure, that's an important point. Certainly Muslims themselves would say Jesus cannot have conceived of God as male, because he had the same doctrine as did all of the other prophets, and this must be a misunderstanding or an entification of a term that was meant as some kind of metaphor. Nonetheless, I think one has to take the feminist objections seriously, and that historically injustices have been worked on the basis of what you take to be a misunderstanding of what Jesus intended. And I'm not here to pass judgment on Christian doctrine or to say what is right Christianity, what is wrong Christianity. I'm merely pointing out certain trends that seem to me as an outsider to be moving forward and suggesting what the implications for that might be for dialogue. But I'm not suggesting what the correct Christian position should be. Yeah.
Does anybody else got an intellectual question before I ask them this now? Middle school teachers. My kids would want to know about the black stone. Right at the very beginning, you said something about the black stone, the comet.
Okay.
I've got various different, depending on which source you read, you know, it's sent down by God to Abraham and from heaven. What's the real deal? You said they don't worship it, but basically...
It's not worship. Its effective function is to serve as a marker to show people where they start the tawaf. Otherwise, symbolically, it's God's right hand on earth. And one of the things the pilgrim can do, optionally, is to kiss it, which is an emblem of kissing the hand of God, i.e. reaffirming the Abrahamic covenant, which is the function of the pilgrimage. The function of the pilgrimage is to show that you're part of the Abrahamic covenant and dimension of the religion. So the pilgrims ideally can kiss the stone, although generally people nowadays don't, because if you've got 2 million people in front of you who also want to kiss the black stone, you have to be a kind of all-in wrestler before you get within 20 feet of it. And
so symbolically, it is a physical manifestation of something that Allah sent to earth.
it's a symbol, yes, but it's not regarded as something that's intrinsically holy or a relic or anything like that. It's not worshipped or regarded in that way.
Well, you just said, sort of sparked a question. I mean, any religion in its beginning is sort of controllable just from the amount of worshippers there are. And Islam now is just outrageously huge. I mean, have there been, discussions or problems with, as far as like the Hajj? I mean, it's just so cumbersome now than it would have been, 500 years ago.
The Hajj. The Hajj is overcrowded. Until 50 years ago, only about 100,000, 200,000 people did it. Nonetheless, I've done it 3 times, and it's not intolerably overcrowded. You just have to know exactly the times to go. You go at 3 in the morning rather than at 4 in the afternoon when everybody else is going. Or you do the tawaf on the roof rather than trying to get close to the Kaaba. And the Saudis do try to restrict numbers. They impose quotas on different countries. Like every year, only 100,000 people are given visas in Nigeria, for instance, and it's a similar number for Bangladesh, etc. And sometimes those countries also impose quotas because it's bad for their balance of payments to have lots of people taking money out of the country and spending it in Mecca. So there are attempts now to put a lid on it, but theoretically the Hajj could accommodate a lot more. Was that what you wanted to know? Yeah.
I mean, just from a Christian perspective, I think that a lot of the theology or the practice, the larger you get, the more, in some ways, away from the kernel, the truth, the simple truth. So I didn't know if that's happening, through the years.
One of the interesting
Islam.
things about the basic practices of Islam is that although they were framed within the context of small Arabian communities in the 7th century, they are all perfectly practicable today. And the Hajj is an example of that. In fact, it's easier to do the Hajj now than it was, say, 100 years ago, because you have dozens of little health clinics there, you have an airport, you have air conditioning in tents, and you can do it in style. You can live in a villa in Muzdalifah instead of a tent if you want to do that. So I think it's become easier for a lot of people than more difficult. And Muslims would hold this up as one of the proofs of the eternal validity of the religion, that despite its specific 7th century Arabian origins, it still works today, and that you can practice it in Abiquiu, New Mexico, really just as easily as you could in 7th century Medina, despite sometimes the complexity of its rulings. I think perhaps that's enough, and I'm feeling a bit hollow. I don't know about you people.